It's time, Cougar Nation. Cougar Tracks. The best season analysis with BYU insider Mitch Harper on KSL NewsRadio and on video every day on the YouTube page for KSL Sports.
Welcome into Cougar Tracks here on the KSL Sports YouTube and KSL NewsRadio, your legacy home of the Cougars. It's Wednesday, January 21st, and I am your BYU insider, Mitch Harper. It has arrived, folks. The 2026 BYU football schedule is here. Let's dive right in, not waste any time, and unpack my thoughts on this new BYU football schedule for the 2026 season.
The top story of the day. The biggest story in the world of BYU sports right here on Cougar Tracks.
This is always one of my favorite days in the BYU football offseason, the Big 12 schedule release. The Big 12 had a schedule release show earlier today on ESPNU, True TV, YouTube, all the different streaming platforms. Really cool. Big 12 Studios put together a show, and they rolled out all 16 Big 12 schedules. It's year 3 in the 16-team Big 12, and BYU comes into this season with high expectations after an appearance in the Big 12 championship game in 2025, a 12-2 record, a Pop-Tarts Bowl championship. BYU is looking for more in 2026. With all the players that are running it back, the path is now in front of them officially for the 2026 season. And this is how it stacks up. 7 home games, 5 road games, which is noteworthy. Every single year you can get that. That's a big deal. So here's how it lays out. September 5th, the season kicks off against Utah Tech in Provo. September 12th, Big 12 opener against the Arizona Wildcats in Week 2. At Colorado State, September 19th. TCU on October 3rd on the road in Fort Worth. Iowa State, October 10th. Notre Dame comes to Provo for the first time since 2004 on Saturday, October 17th in Provo. Big-time game. At UCF, October 24th. Arizona State on Halloween. At Utah, November 7th. Baylor, November 14th. At Kansas. Oh, no. Kansas in November. Kansas in Lawrence, November 21st. And then Cincinnati, November 28th. That's your schedule for BYU football in 2026. 11 FBS opponents on the schedule, and those 11 FBS teams combined for a 60% winning percentage last season, 84-54. 7 teams qualified for the postseason, 2 of which, Notre Dame and Iowa State, did not opt to play in a bowl game, but a good chunk of this schedule were teams that were eligible for the postseason. I think the big standout from this schedule, first off, is the fact that BYU has 7 home games. Getting Notre Dame on the schedule is a massive deal. And typically with 7 home games, you look at BYU history and point to that's probably going to lead to a double-digit win season. The last time it happened was in 2020. That was the COVID season where BYU was cobbling together a schedule. They finished with 11 wins. Go back to 2011, the first year of independence. They had 7 home games, 10 wins. Go back even further, 1996. That was a big inflated schedule with the Pigskin Classic in week 0. But 7 home games, 14 wins that season for BYU. So BYU in a good spot with just the home games, because last year they go 12-2 and they had a lot of road games, a lot of games away from Provo. You think about those 14 games, 8 of them were away from home, and you had to get on a plane and go travel to those games. The 5 road games for BYU, you only leave the Mountain Time Zone 3 times, and you only leave the state of Utah 4 times. So I just think from a logistics perspective of simply getting on a plane, excessive travel, there's not as much of that in 2026, which is something I really like about this year's schedule. The bye for BYU lands on September 26th, pretty early in a season where you only get 1 bye. That's because the season starts in September, so there's not the flexibility to have 2 byes in a year as we've seen the past 2 seasons. So BYU is going to have 9 straight weeks of action. That's a lot. That is a lot of football consecutively to play. The good thing for BYU, they feel like they've got pretty good depth, a good roster, a lot of talent at the top end, and some good players in those second and third units to withstand that, because sometimes playoff runs and championship runs, it's about depth and withstanding, avoiding injuries and health. That is a key piece to a lot of this. The non-conference games, as I mentioned, Utah Tech, Colorado State, Notre Dame. Notre Dame is a massive game. That might be the game of the year for Big 12 teams next year when you consider BYU, the expectations for them, and Notre Dame. They're in some way too early polls. ESPN has them at number 3. So there's a lot of high expectations for the Fighting Irish and Marcus Freeman and his crew going into 2026. And if they live up to that, and if BYU lives up to that, look, I don't get into hyperbole much with BYU football. I always talked about this. I respect the history a ton. But if BYU and Notre Dame say they're undefeated at the midway point of the season, you could make the case that would be the second biggest game in LaVell Edwards Stadium history, behind only BYU versus Miami in 1990. And maybe with the stakes being even higher, potentially, I say that potentially just because Miami was number 1. They were the U, and BYU catapulted into the top 5 after that win. And that was such a big-time win with so much mystique and aura. But if BYU and Notre Dame are top 10 with the playoff element to all of this, wow, that could be a huge game. The other 2 non-conference games, not great. Colorado State was 2-10. They bring in Jim Mora from UConn as their new head coach. They also brought former BYU assistant quarterback coach Matt Mitchell. He's their QB coach. And then Utah Tech's the FCS team here down in St. George. They'll come up and probably take their beat down, and BYU will move on with their day. I think the bye is a little bit noteworthy, though, how early it is. I think also the Utah game, November 7th, we'll hit on that a little bit more coming up later, but the Big 12 reverts back to that spot in the schedule for that Salt Lake game. So maybe there's a cadence there of, for Salt Lake games, that's where it's going to be. For Provo games, maybe it's mid-October where the Notre Dame game landed. Alternate years. We'll see, because we're noticing some tendencies with these schedules. You know, the UCF game is in the same spot it was in 2 years ago when BYU last traveled to Orlando. Kansas, late November again. Cincinnati, another November spot. 3 years ago, that was a one-off schedule before the Four Corner schools joined the league. So a little bit of tendencies we're seeing. The one that's kind of outside the box, or maybe flipped a little bit, is Baylor and TCU. But TCU was in Provo last year in that, November 15th, November 14th spot, and BYU was in Waco 2 years ago in that, right before General Conference weekend. So again, a little bit of tendencies. You kind of get deep in the weeds with that, but you start to notice these trends a little bit with this schedule for BYU. We'll unpack more of my thoughts, the rivalry piece to all of this with BYU and Utah getting set for November 7th. The rivalry game will continue. We'll hit on that, and also more of my thoughts on the Big 12 schedule at large. This is Cougar Tracks, and it's powered by KSLSports.com. Welcome back into Cougar Tracks here on the KSL Sports YouTube page. I am your BYU insider, Mitch Harper. Every day, we're talking BYU sports, BYU football, BYU basketball, right here on KSL News Radio and the KSL Sports YouTube. So if you could be kind enough, subscribe to the YouTube page for KSL Sports and this podcast on audio platforms. Check it out on the KSL Sports app. So many different ways to unpack and listen and watch this show. Appreciate you for being on board every single day talking BYU sports. So the Big 12 schedule beyond BYU, again, all 16 teams release their schedule. Some initial takeaways from the rest of the conference, big picture, looking at the league race as a whole, because BYU feels like they're in the center of all of this. BYU is going to be one of the favorites in the Big 12 next season. You can make an argument they're number one. You really could. I'd still say number two just because I really like some of the additions that Texas Tech has made. But then even further, I think you like Texas Tech even more potentially because I think they got the most favorable draw. You look at Texas Tech's schedule. They've got Houston, Arizona State, Arizona, TCU, all in Lubbock. I would argue those are maybe the toughest games on their Big 12 schedule in 2026, and they're all coming to Lubbock. I think that's significant. Texas Tech's non-conference schedule is incredibly weak. They've got Abilene Christian, at Oregon State, and Sam Houston State. That's it. I wish Texas Tech could have leveled up and did what BYU did and got an upgrade on a game. It was nice that Cal had the 9-game conference schedule change in the ACC that allowed this opportunity to pop up for BYU because it probably was very unique and a headache at times for the Big 12 to work in a mid-season non-conference game. The Big 12 doesn't typically have this. You kind of look at, the recent history of the Big 12, but even further back in the Texas-Oklahoma years, it's not often you're seeing the Big 12 work in a non-conference game in the middle of the season. So kind of unique. I wish Texas Tech could have pulled something off like that too, especially with the BYU Notre Dame game on the heels of the Big 12 commissioner, Brett Yormark, kind of teeing up on Notre Dame for the way that they acted about the playoff results. And then one of his members, BYU, adds Notre Dame. Still, I think it's good for the league to have BYU and Notre Dame because, again, it's a marquee event and it maybe gives BYU potentially a little bit of a margin for error because then there's ability to recover if you lost that game midway through the season. Look at what happened to Utah. Utah lost to BYU in that same weekend, and they had some time to recover. Now, they didn't have that signature game to really catapult them into the rankings, and quite frankly, BYU just wasn't losing other than the Texas Tech game. BYU kept doing its thing, but Utah potentially could have controlled its destiny had BYU lost to Cincinnati. The Utes would have probably been in the Big 12 championship game. There was enough time to recover, and then they would have been 60 minutes away from getting to the playoffs. So things like that are kind of interesting. I wish Texas Tech could have got a bigger non-conference opponent, but that's one of the reasons I like Texas Tech again, because I like their draw. I think they've got a very favorable path to getting back to Arlington, and maybe we see BYU and Texas Tech again in 2026. Iowa State, UCF, Arizona, I bring all them up. They've got their buys right in the middle of the season in week 7. So 6 weeks behind them, 6 weeks in front of them, kind of the ideal spot to get a bye, I would say. BYU, Arizona State, and Kansas, they have the earliest buys in the Big 12 schedule. And what's of note there, BYU's probably got the earliest bye because outside of just normal scheduling, because Arizona State and Kansas have a game in London in week 3, and then they're taking, obviously, week 4 off to recuperate and get their body back to their usual body clocks. So BYU's kind of got the earliest bye in large part, again, because of that quirky addition of Notre Dame, which is going to be a huge contest for BYU and the Big 12 on this schedule, but it's an early bye for the Cougars. Arizona State, I think, might have the toughest schedule and the unique challenges of their slate in 2026. Arizona State has at Texas A&M in week 2. I love that. That's awesome. Kansas in London. Overseas games, I think they're cool, and I like that the Big 12 embraces them. I think they're okay. I mean, Arizona State in Tempe or in Lawrence, I mean, either way, it's not going to be some marquee event. I just really wonder if there's going to be many people in London to go to that game. But the travel side of it and coming back from across the pond, we've learned with those college football games in week 0 in Dublin, it usually can have a grave effect on a season. And to do one in the middle of the year in week 3, that's interesting to me. Baylor is on Arizona State's schedule. Hawaii at Texas Tech. K-State at BYU. Colorado at UCF. Oklahoma State at Arizona. I think that's a tough schedule. Arizona State, I think, is going to be really good. Again, I know they lost a lot. Sam Leavitt, Jordan Tyson, all the marquee names, but I think they retooled nicely in the portal. I like their quarterback options that they have. They bring in a transfer from Kentucky. I mean, it wasn't long ago when Kenny Dillingham identified Sam Leavitt as an unknown guy at Michigan State and turned him into a star. I would expect nothing less. Like, I have all the confidence in the world that Kenny Dillingham, whoever he has, he's going to win ball games. But that's a tough schedule that Arizona State has in front of them in 2026. Some other odds and ends that I noticed in the Big 12 2026 schedule. UCF has a stretch where they get 4 league games at home over a 5-week span, starting with BYU, Baylor, then at Kansas, Arizona State, Iowa State. So maybe kind of a back half of the season, really get a chance for UCF in year 2 with Scott Frost to make a push to try to get in the conversation for the Big 12 title race potentially. I don't see that happening, but again, this is the Big 12. In the last 3 years since BYU joined the league, it's been 6 different teams have reached the Big 12 championship game. The Big 12 championship game moves to a Friday, December 4th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time on ABC. It moves from the Saturday 10 a.m. spot, 11 a.m. Central, to a primetime Friday night spot. Personally, do not like that. Now, the Big 12 did say it's going to rotate, and it's going to be an every other year thing with Friday and Saturday. Personally, I wish it was just that Saturday morning spot because that got great viewership. It kind of had its own window, standalone opportunity to really get a huge audience. Those 10 a.m. games, people complain about them, but they deliver massive TV numbers. They're huge audiences. 9 million for the Big 12 championship game in a game that was a blowout. And it got 9 million viewers. By comparison, the American, which played that Friday night ABC game, primetime spot, which the Big 12 is going to take over, is about 2.5. I'd have to go back and look at what the Pac-12 was getting on their Friday night spots. But anything that kind of reminds me a little bit of the old Pac-12, I don't want to do if I'm the Big 12. But you kind of have to adhere to what the TV networks are wanting, so you go to a Friday. I'm glad that it's not an every year thing on Fridays. I like the Saturday morning spot for the Big 12 championship game personally. I think it's a good spot to kind of set the tone for the day on College Football Championship Saturday. But honestly, I wouldn't be opposed to just ditching the championship games altogether in the future and just have it be the regular season with these supersized conferences where you don't play 6 teams. BYU has 6 teams that they don't play in the league this year, one of which is Texas Tech, Colorado, Houston, Oklahoma State, West Virginia. They don't play those teams. Kansas State, they don't play them. So in a league where you don't come close to playing everyone, I wouldn't be opposed to just not having championship games at all, but that game does move to a Friday night spot. Cincinnati, other odds and ends. Cincinnati opens the season with 4 straight home games, so maybe Scott Satterfield and his crew can get off to another fast start. They were one of the trendy teams in the league early on, and then they faded down the stretch. West Virginia only has 1 true road game in the first 7 weeks of the season. That's at Iowa State. They play Virginia in week 3, but that's in Charlotte. And I would expect West Virginia fans would show up nicely for that one. 4 of Utah's first 5 games are at home. They've got 7 home games on their schedule. Lone road game is week 4 at Iowa State. K-State, 5 of the first 6 games for them are at home. So the Colin Klein era is basically going to reside in the Little Apple for the first half of the season. The lone road game is at Cincinnati. TCU, they get 2 byes in their season because they've got week 0 in Dublin, and then, of course, their regular bye week, which will come in week 6. Texas Tech versus Arizona State in week 7. I think that's going to be an awesome game. The last 2 Big 12 champions. Some other noteworthy games on the schedule that kind of caught my attention in terms of non-conference. Oklahoma State host Oregon. Eric Morris, he brings over a ton of North Texas transfers that were highly productive and had North Texas knocking on the door of the college football playoff. Why can't Morris have a Cignetti-type flip at Oklahoma State that's had, recent success within the past 20 years? Why can't he flip it with guys that were knocking on the door of the playoff? Maybe that's a bit much to say playoff, but wouldn't be surprised if Oklahoma State is very competitive right out of the chute with Morris as their head coach. No buys for any team in the Big 12 in the final 4 weeks of the season, which I'm excited about because there were some times in early November where you're thinking, man, the Big 12 schedule is kind of light. There's not many games on the docket. Well, that was because of the 2 buys, so everyone gets those in. Final 4 weeks of the season, the last push to Arlington, that's going to be epic. Week 1, marquee Big 12 games. It's kind of light on the Week 1 schedule, and BYU doesn't help the cause with a game against Utah Tech. But Week 1, lid lifters that are awesome in the Big 12, I think. Baylor versus Auburn in Atlanta. I wish that was, at Jordan-Hare. Auburn came to Baylor last year. Why not go to Jordan-Hare? But it's in Atlanta. That'll be a pro-Auburn crowd who's near Atlanta, of course. Cincinnati versus Boston College. Colorado at Georgia Tech. There'll be 2 Big 12 teams in Week 1 in Atlanta that weekend. If you're a Big 12 fan, that's like the perfect weekend. Hopefully one of those games is a morning kick, and then the other's in the evening. Go check out 2 Big 12 games in the same city in the same weekend. That'd be awesome. And then Oklahoma State at Tulsa, just because, again, I'm really intrigued by Morris and that Oklahoma State team in 2026. But that's kind of some odds and ends and some news and notes about the 2026 Big 12 football schedule at large around the league. But some really good matchups. And there's going to be some games that none of us are thinking of that are going to be absolute bangers. Some awesome games. Who would have thought 2 years ago 2024 BYU and Arizona State would have been as awesome as that one was? I mean, that was an outstanding game. I know BYU lost that one and they started just in terrible fashion, but the scene, the atmosphere, the intensity, the stakes, there's going to be some game or two that we don't expect that's going to just be absolute cinema. And we're going to just be blown away by that game in the Big 12. And I think that's one of the fun things about this league is trying to figure out which ones could those be potentially. Because I think when you get these schedule releases, I think sometimes you just look at the matchups and say, well, what's to write home about that? Still, I think there's going to be some really good games in this Big 12 schedule, and there's some that are hidden in the weeds that we don't know about right now, that when we get into the guts of Big 12 play, we'll start to definitely learn that for sure. Let's take our final timeout. We'll get to the BYU-Utah rivalry game and some other news and notes around BYU's 2026 schedule right here on Cougar Tracks, and it's powered by KSL Sports. Welcome back into Cougar Tracks here on KSL News Radio and the KSL Sports YouTube page. Mitch Harper here with you. So BYU and Utah are going to be playing on Saturday, November 7th. It's year 3 in the Big 12 for these heated in-state rivals, and so many people, since these two joined the Big 12, often ask, why do they not play on the final week of the season? Traditional rivalry week spot. That's what it always was in the WAC and in the Mountain West. Final week of the season, death, taxes, and BYU and Utah lacing it up on the final week of the season. In the Big 12, that never happens. Well, here's an explanation that I thought was pretty good from the Big 12's chief football and competition officer, Scott Draper, who's the mastermind behind creating these Big 12 schedules. He was on Inside the 12, Big 12 Studios in-house production today on the schedule release, and he discussed rivalries and what goes into the reasoning to spread out rivalries within the Big 12 Conference.
Our strategy around rivalry games is really this. There are some games that have been played forever and other than really Arizona State have occurred in multiple parts of the season, right? So the tradition of playing Thanksgiving weekend, all rivalry games, is not something that a lot of the games that have been that we call rivalries has occurred over a period of years. So there's some history and tradition that we want to continue to maintain. But from the value to the league and why those games are important, certainly they're important to the participating schools and their fan bases. But it's important that we showcase those games in the best windows and the best opportunities for the most people around the country to see them. And I look forward to not only the games that are traditional rivalry games, but the games that are starting to build because of the transition of members over the last few years.
That is a good point. There are some rivalries that are building in the Big 12. I think BYU and Arizona State's evolving into a rivalry, and maybe BYU Texas Tech. I don't know if I see that yet, but BYU Arizona State definitely has rivalry potential within the Big 12. But BYU and Utah, I thought that was a good breakdown from Scott Draper. And is it right? I'm indifferent about it because when I do take a step back and think about his explanation, a lot of these rivalry games, BYU and Utah, sadly, during the Independence Pac-12 years, they never played at the final week of the season. They were always playing in August, September. They had 1 week, or 1 season rather, in 2018 where they played on the final week of the season, and there was no excitement about it, and that was that. So I guess where I'm getting at is that it's been 16 years since the last time these programs were traditionally always on the final week of the season. This game always delivers. It's always great. I just thought this year was the one where it made sense to put that game on the final week of the season because then it could be a final push to Arlington to get a BYU, get even a Utah in year one under Morgan Scalley over the hump to really crystallize a playoff resume and make it clear, win or lose in a Big 12 championship game, you belong in the playoff. That was kind of my thought behind a BYU and Utah. To say Arizona State, just because they've always played it there, no one is going to say that game is more intense than BYU and Utah. No one is going to argue that Arizona and Arizona State is bigger than BYU Utah. Look, I know I'm up close to the BYU Utah rivalry, but anyone that is a part of this thing and sees both rivalries, come on, just get on social media for like an hour between these two fan bases and tell me which one's more intense. But I think it's an okay explanation. And look, you're trying to do everything to give your TV partners great games and great inventory throughout the season. They're paying $2 billion, ESPN and Fox, to have a great product. And BYU and Utah is one, though, that always delivers. That is for sure. Other games and other news and notes on this schedule. So the dates are not necessarily finalized for some of these games. The Big 12 did note that select Saturday games in the 2026 season may be moved to select Fridays, other special dates, and Black Friday, which will be announced in the coming weeks. And I bring that up because a scheduling quirk that's unique to BYU, the Cougars are currently scheduled to play on General Conference Saturday at TCU on Saturday, October 3rd. I think you got to go back to 2003, maybe. Yeah, 2003 against San Diego State, the last time BYU played on a General Conference Saturday. There's still the possibility maybe that game goes to a Friday spot. We'll see, but it is interesting that BYU would play a road game. And they've played on the road in the past before. It's happened on General Conference Saturday. Maybe it could be a late night game. We'll see. But BYU is currently scheduled for a General Conference Saturday tilt in Cowtown against the TCU Horned Frogs. Currently no Friday games, weeknight games on the schedule, which is crazy because I feel like BYU is synonymous with weeknight football. I really look at BYU as one of the founders of weeknight football from its days back on Thursday nights on ESPN, them and Virginia Tech, and to not see any weeknight games, I can't imagine that's going to hold up. I would think there's going to be one, maybe two on the weeknight schedule because BYU likes them too. I think this program loves a good weeknight game. I know selfishly, I love weeknight games. I think they're a blast. But we'll see how that evolves for sure. But we'll have you covered throughout the season, the off season, to get you ready for this 2026 season that is going to be highly anticipated. It's going to be a lot of fun. So that's going to do it for this edition of Cougar Tracks. Share with me your thoughts about this schedule on KSLSports.com or on X, Mitch_Harper. We'll go in that direction. Talk to you tomorrow here on Cougar Tracks, and it's powered by KSL Sports.